little later on as we're together. I'll look at it live. This is available free online, and I know that some of you are using this. This is the 2016 version. It's been up on the website for quite some time for you to try it. This is the same thing, although it's a little bit bigger. I've cut it in two so that you can see what it's about here. And the highlighted yellow part here, this is a result. The results are always in blue font, and the inputs are in black font. This result is the final result. This is the required mechanical ventilation, or Q fan, as it is termed in the standard, in this case 38 CFM. Again, we will look at a live version of this calculation aid a little bit later on.
Rick, we already have one question which I think is very pertinent. It's in terms of the application of the standard. Someone asked, is it in effect? My response to that person was the local authority of with jurisdiction decides. And can you just elaborate that a little bit more as to, can they use a different version of the standard, and is it actually the local authority with jurisdiction that does enforce this?
Yeah, thank you to whomever asked that, and thank you, Bill. That's a good question. And Bill's answer is right. It's the authority having jurisdiction would make that decision. Now, many of you, I expect, who are with us today are working with the DOE-sponsored low-income weatherization program. In that case, it's my opinion that DOE is the authority so they would decide when you need to start using it. And as far as I know, what they have done in the past is by the beginning of your next program year, which for many of you will happen mid this year, you probably have to be up and running with the new version, the 2016 version. Up until that time, you may use the 2013 version. For other folks, if you're working with a utility program, the utility program will be the authority having jurisdiction. If you're working in a town that uses the standard as a code, they would be the authority that would decide that. So what Bill said is true. It depends upon where you are, what your service territory is, and what program you are working with. Significant changes to the new standard, the 2016 version. I'm not going to go over all of the changes, but just the ones I think that are most important to you. First of all, I've already mentioned the expansion of the scope of the standard. This building is now included under the standard. That is, the dwelling units in this building are included within the 62.2 2016 standard. In the 2013 version, it was buildings of 3 or more stories, 3 or fewer stories above grade. Now that is gone, and it's a building, a multifamily building of any height, such as the one in the photo. There is a special consideration in the 2016 version of the standard that has to do with horizontally attached units. Horizontally attached units such as duplexes, the photo on the left, townhouses, the photo on the right, or triplexes, quadplexes. Those types of multifamily attached dwelling units may take a partial infiltration credit. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail. On the other hand, if the dwellings, the multifamily dwellings, are stacked one above another, there is no infiltration credit allowed. So the only multifamily building that is allowed any type of infiltration credit, that is a credit for natural air leakage, is a horizontally attached unit, such as a duplex, triplex, or row houses. Now this has to do with that credit for horizontally attached buildings. It is based on, this is the Q fan, is the amount of ventilation we must get mechanically from the fan. This is Q tote, this is our target. We'll look at this again. And Q fan is equal to Q tote minus the infiltration credit. That is the amount of air we're getting naturally from the outside. For horizontally attached units, we multiply, we don't multiply, but what we do is derive this A exterior, which is the exterior surface of that particular dwelling unit in a horizontally attached multifamily, over the total envelope surface. And we'll look at an example soon. So if that is perhaps 80%, this comes out being 80%, that means we only get 80% of the infiltration credit. If it's a detached dwelling unit, like a single family detached home, A exterior is equal to 1. And if it's a dwelling unit in a stacked multifamily, there is no infiltration credit allowed at all. So what you do to take this credit is do a blower door test on the unit in question, say in a duplex. You calculate the fraction of the enclosure area, 6 sides of it, that is not attached to other units or garages. Again, this is only horizontally attached. And then you multiply the infiltration estimate from the blower door by this fraction, as I explained down here in the yellow box, the A exterior. Local kitchen ventilation. By the way, before, I'll just go back to that a moment. We'll go over the RED ASHRAE 62.2 2016 calculation aid. It takes care of this calculation for you. It makes it quite a bit easier. Local kitchen ventilation has changed somewhat in the 2016 version of the standard. Kitchens are now classified as enclosed or non-enclosed. Enclosed or non-enclosed. And an enclosed kitchen is defined as having permanent openings to adjacent interior spaces that do not exceed a total of 60 square feet. That is approximately 3 doorways. So if it's more than 60 square feet, then it would be non-enclosed. If it's 60 feet or less, it would be enclosed. And depending upon which type it is, we have different requirements. If the minimum dwelling unit ventilation is 15 CFM, or 7 liters per second, or less, no dwelling unit ventilation is required to be installed. Many of you have been using this de minimis for existing dwellings for almost 2 years now. It was officially released a while ago, but it is officially in the 2016 version of the standard. This is there for existing dwellings to make things a little easier for you and to bring the costs down. Now let's look at local ventilation a little more carefully. Local ventilation, the primary purpose for putting exhaust fans in bathrooms and kitchens is to get rid of the worst air quickly. In bathrooms, that's probably very humid air from showering or bathing. In kitchens, where the air is potentially more damaging, more hazardous, getting rid of cooking odors from baking and range-top cooking. Range-top cooking tends to be the most hazardous. Local ventilation must be exhaust ventilation. It cannot be supply ventilation. We want to extract it as quickly as we can. Bathrooms, there is no change for bathrooms from the 2013 version of the standard. If it's demand controlled ventilation, that is, for example, it's a fan in the ceiling, the occupant walks into the bathroom, flips a switch, or an occupancy sensor turns it on automatically, that must be at least 50 CFM. If it's continuously operating ventilation on all the time, it must be at least 20 CFM. So that's exactly the same as it was in the 2013 version of the standard. No changes. Kitchens are, on the other hand, different. For demand controlled ventilation in the kitchen, imagine a range hood over a range that has a switch that the person doing the cooking can turn on and off. If it is an enclosed kitchen, remember that's 60 square feet or less to other rooms in the house, the range hood 100 CFM minimum. Another fan, this is a change for many of you, if it's another fan on a wall or in a ceiling and you're installing it new, it must be 300 CFM or 5 air changes per hour based upon the volume of the kitchen. So that 300 CFM is new. Remember, if it's a range hood, you put in a new range hood right over the range, it's the same, 100 CFM. But if it's in a wall, you put in a new wall fan, or you put in a new ceiling fan in a kitchen, make sure the fan is rated for a kitchen, it must be 300. The 300 also applies to a downdrafting fan, such as a Gen Air. If it's a non-enclosed kitchen, fairly well connected to the rest of the dwelling, range hood 100 CFM minimum, another fan must be in 300 CFM minimum if it's in the wall or the ceiling. If it's a non-enclosed kitchen, there is no 5 ACH choice, no 5 air changes per hour choice, because then you would have to take the volume of the entire house, and that just doesn't make sense. So this is a fairly significant change with a kitchen. There is a detail here. If you're leaving a fan in place, of course, you can leave it as it is. And when you're taking a deficit for the kitchen, in an existing home, for the alternative compliance path, which we'll look at briefly at the end of my talk, the highest deficit for a kitchen, no matter what the fan is 100 CFM. Continuously operating fans in a kitchen, an enclosed kitchen, 5 air changes per hour. Continuously operating in a non-enclosed kitchen is not allowed. Now, dwelling unit ventilation, which is intended to dilute the air in the home, this, in the 2013 version of the standard, was referred to as whole building ventilation. And previous to that, it was referred to as whole house ventilation. The dwelling unit ventilation assumes there are 2 occupants in the master bedroom and 1 in each of the other bedrooms. And we'll look very soon at the basic equation for what's called Q-tote. The ventilation air must come directly from the outdoors, and an infiltration credit is allowed for envelope air leakage, except if it's stacked multifamily. This is the basic equation from ASHRAE 62, 2016 for dwelling unit ventilation, Q-tote. It is exactly the same as the basic equation in the 2013 version of the standard. It is 3% of the floor area plus 7.5 CFM times the number of bedrooms plus 1. The number of bedrooms plus 1 is an attempt to get at the number of people in the house. If you're working on a new house and you're looking at blueprints, You don't know how many people will live in the house, but you do know how many bedrooms are there. So you can count the bedrooms, assuming 2 people in the master bedroom and 1 in each of the other bedrooms. That's where this comes from. Dwelling unit ventilation requirements may be satisfied by intermittent ventilation, operating the fan intermittently. Now, some of you, I've caught you on this, you know who you are, call dwelling unit ventilation or whole house or whole building ventilation, you call it continuous ventilation. I strongly recommend you stop using the term continuous because it can be confused with many other things, such as continuously operating bathroom ventilation. So call it dwelling unit ventilation. It may run all the time, or it may run intermittently. An example of intermittent operation is right here. Let's say we have a heat recovery ventilator that has a capacity of 150 CFM, but we only need 50 CFM. Well, we can operate it 20 minutes on and 40 minutes off every hour, and that will give us the equivalent of 50 CFM. So that would satisfy things. The infiltration credit for existing and new buildings, it's a little bit different. One is different from the other. This is for existing buildings, dwelling unit ventilation for existing buildings, and the RED calculation aid does all of this for you. Here again is the basic equation in the green bar here. Q tote is equal to 3% of the floor area plus 7.5 CFM times the number of bedrooms plus 1. So that's Q tote. That's where that comes from. That is the starting point for our dwelling unit ventilation. This has nothing directly to do with bathroom, local bathroom and kitchen ventilation. For existing dwellings, and many of you are dealing with existing dwellings exclusively, you then add the alternative compliance supplement, which comes from the alternative compliance path. We'll go through that with the RED tool briefly. Then we subtract the infiltration credit, which is QINF, INF standing for infiltration, and that gives us the required mechanical ventilation rate, or Q fan. For an existing building, we can take the entire infiltration credit. Remember, however, the limitations for multifamily. If it's horizontally attached, we can only take part of it. And if it's multifamily and the dwelling units are stacked, there is no infiltration credit allowed for existing buildings or new multifamily. This is the RED calculation aid. And this part right here is the alternative compliance part that shows the alternative compliance path that the standard allows for existing buildings. Basically what happens here is that if you go into an existing house, let's say it's a single family detached house, and there is not 100, there's a fan in the kitchen, but it only is giving you a flow rate of 65. You may leave it there. You don't have to replace it. It means you're deficient in the kitchen, but you don't have to replace it. Again, this is to save money. If there's a window in the kitchen, an operable window, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, you get a credit of 20. So we end up with a deficit in the kitchen of 15. Let's say there's a fan in the bathroom that has a 25 flow rate. You're going to leave it there. There is an openable window in the bathroom. That gives it a deficit of 5. And in bathroom 2, let's say there's a fan that has a flow rate of 30, but there's no window. So here there's a deficit of 20. Remember, there's supposed to be 50 here, but if you're leaving the fan in place, you have 30 no window, so you have 50 minus 30 is 20, so there's the deficit there. So the total deficit for this house is 40. With simple math, we divide that by 10. This is the alternative compliance supplement, right? I'm sorry, we divide this by 4. The alternative compliance supplement for this house is 10. 40 divided by 4 is 10. So that gets added, and we end up with 48. Again, we'll go through an example. A little bit more about the alternative compliance path. By the way, this is exactly the same as it was in the 2010, 2013, and now the 2016 version of the standard. This is something that's important in green, this last bullet. Always use the post-retrofit fan flow rates that you measure when you put the values in the RED tool or whatever calculation aid you're using. These have to be the ones that are going to remain in place. So the alternative compliance path, as I explained, each room where local ventilation should be, determine the deficit, which we just looked at. The bathroom is supposed to be 50. If it's less than that, you have a deficit for an existing fan. The kitchen, how much less than 100 is it? For each room with a deficit, we can reduce the deficit by 20 CFM if that room has an openable window. The deficits are added up and then divided by 4, as we saw in the RED calculation aid. Then this amount, in the example I showed you, that was 10. That gets added to the required mechanical dwelling unit ventilation rate. And this is available for existing dwellings only. If you leave a fan in place in an existing dwelling, in a kitchen or a bathroom, there are no sound requirements. If you put in a new fan, there are sound requirements, but not for one that you leave in place. So 3 examples for the alternative compliance path. This is a house with 3 bedrooms. 3 bedrooms, example number 1. Each example is the same house, but I'm going to change the characteristics a bit. Here's the kitchen. There's no window, there's no fan. This is what a window looks like. There's no window in the kitchen. There's no fan. So the deficit is 100, so that's right here. Here's a bathroom, no fan, no window. The deficit is 50. Here's the master bath, no fan, no window. The deficit is 50. So the total deficit, 100 plus 50 is 200. We divide that by 4, and we have an alternative compliance supplement of 50. So let's say that we started with the required ventilation rate of 45 CFM. We would then add 50 to it to get 95. I'm going to take a sip of water. So let's take this example and change it slightly. Now let's put a window in the kitchen, a window in this bathroom, and a fan in the master bath. The kitchen has a window that is openable, so we can reduce the deficit by 20. So now we have a negative 80 there, an 80 deficit. We put a window in this bathroom, so we can reduce the deficit of 50 by 20, which gives us a deficit of 30. The master bath still doesn't have a window, but now it has an operable fan existing that we measure the flow rate. We get 32. We subtract 32 from 50. It has a deficit of 18. We add those up. We get 128. Divide them by 4. We get 32. And that gets added to the initial Q-tote value right here of 45. Last example, now we've got the kitchen's the same, the deficit is still 80, no fan, but an openable window. In this case now we have a deficit of 0 because we're going to put the dwelling unit continuous fan here. We're going to operate this all the time. It's not going to be operated intermittently, so that reduces the deficit in this bathroom to 0. And we have the same situation here. So the total deficit now is 80 plus 0 plus 18 is 98, divided by 4 is about 25. So 45 plus 25 gives us 70. Bill, any questions? I want to take a break from talking.
Hey, Rick. It's Jay West.
Hi, Jay.
How you doing? I've been back here answering some questions under the guise of Bill Spone.
Okay.
However, we do have some questions, and they, I think, fall along some of the usual lines that that people ask. One of them being, the basement or utility room that's connected to the house. Are these considered part of the usable space or inhabitable space? Is that the term that we're using?
Good question. I don't like the question because it's hard to answer, but it's a good question. That comes into play for the floor area, the 3% of the floor area, and one has to decide what the floor area is. Certainly a bedroom is part of the floor area that gets measured, or the living room, the kitchen, but there are other areas that become questionable. A utility room that is on the floor where most of the living takes place is almost always considered part of the floor area. Where we start to get into some real gray areas is with basements. And where I live in the state of Maine and all around New England, we've got a lot of basements. So this is a big question in this part of the country and in some other parts of the country. The committee dealt with this a couple of years ago and came up with a solution that I'm not totally satisfied with, but it's better than what we had. We had nothing. And now what we have is we cite a standard that is used by the National Home Builders Association for measuring houses for real estate. And what that standard states is that if the basement is finished in a manner similar to the upstairs, it should be counted as part of the floor area. So we continue to look for a better definition, and rather than work on this rather complex problem ourselves, we would prefer to find a standard that someone else has already worked on and toiled over, that we can just adopt and cite in the standard. But so far we haven't found one of those. My advice is that if it looks to you like the basement is lived in and finished, it should be counted. And many basements, part of them are finished and lived in, and the other parts aren't. Well, then just divide it up. But use your head. Remember, the greater the floor area, the greater the ventilation rate will be. And with some basements, if they seem damp, maybe that's the kind of thing you want to happen, even though it's not finished. But whatever you're doing, if you're working in a particular service territory as a contractor, if you are part of a weatherization program in a particular state, I think it's very important for everyone within that particular program, let's say the state of North Dakota, does this kind of thing in a consistent way. There be some memo comes down from the state level that says this is how we're going to deal with basements, for example, and everybody do it the same way.
Great. So I expect that might be the same case with another question about the minimum ventilation. So there was a question that even if the calculator states that you need less than 20 CFM continuous ventilation, do you still have to install a minimum of 20 CFM?
What is often referred to as the minimis, which is unofficial, is not 20, it's 15. So if you find that the whatever calculation aid you are using is 15 CFM or less as your final dwelling unit ventilation rate, Q fan that is, you do not have to install any dwelling unit ventilation. If it's 20, on the other hand, yes, according to the standard, you would need to install 20 CFM.
And now, just to clarify, Rick, that is, now you're speaking from the perspective of the ASHRAE standard, not necessarily as sort of a universal overriding authority as far as, for instance, if they're working in a weatherization program and their state says that they still have to install it, obviously that would override, correct?
I really can't answer that. DOE, when they first required every state to start installing ventilation and do so in a manner that the ASHRAE standard stated to do it, that as it is now, if someone came up with a 20 CFM requirement for whole dwelling ventilation, for dwelling unit ventilation, it would have to be put in the way DOE has interpreted it. If it's 15 CFM, on the other hand, or less, they would not have to put any in. So that's the way, as far as I know, the DOE has been interpreting it. And if a particular state is interpreting it differently than that, that's something I would want to stay out of.
Illinois. Okay.
Okay.
So I want to ask you one quick question, and then I think I have 3 or 4 even quicker questions that are about your schematic, your map from the last slide. So the first one would be basic question: why are the deficits divided by 4?
The deficits are divided by 4 because the idea is that, remember, what we're doing is, if we are deficient with local ventilation, we are compensating for that by adding more dwelling unit ventilation. It's divided by 4 because we assume that if the local ventilation were there and there were no deficit, that ventilation would run approximately 25% of the time. And so that's where the 4 comes from. If it runs 25% of the time, that's one quarter of the time.
Okay. And can you explain why height above grade is maximum exposed area and not average exposed area?
Height above grade.
I think there was a terminology problem or question here: maximum versus average exposed area.
Well, there's an issue. I'm not sure what that question means, but there's an issue having to do with height. That's one of the, if you're taking an infiltration credit, you must enter the height of the building. And the height of the building is determined by the above grade distance, the lowest point to the highest point within the pressure envelope that is above grade. It's not an average, it's a maximum. It's the lowest point above grade to the highest point above grade. That might be what the questioner is trying to get at.
Okay.
It's not an average.
Excellent, thank you. And then I think the next few ones were just referring to your calculations on your floor plan. First question was, why is there a 18 or a negative 18 deficit in the bathroom that you're adding continuous ventilation to?
I'm trying to go back there. Maybe it's this one. I think we can use this one. This is a fan. This is an existing fan. We've taken the same house and we've looked at 3 different examples using that same house. These examples are not necessarily meant to be sequential. or we took the house and we changed like this. It's just that let's assume now that instead of there being no ventilation in the master bathroom, we have 32 CFM fan there. If we put a new fan in this bathroom, it would have to be a 50 CFM fan at minimum. Because we're not putting a new one in here, but we're using the existing one, we subtract the existing flow rate of 32 CFM from 50, the required flow rate of a new fan, and we get 18. So the deficit in this bathroom is 18. And
excellent. Sorry,
this might be part of the question too. The deficit in this bathroom goes away, and this is something that's important for those of you working on existing homes to know. The deficit in this bathroom goes away if we install the whole building ventilation in this bathroom. If our whole building ventilation happens to be 25 as a minimum, and we install that fan in here and it runs all the time, well, ask yourself, for local ventilation that runs all the time, what is the requirement? It's 20 CFM. That's where this comes from. So if we have a 25 CFM fan in this bathroom that is supplying dwelling unit ventilation, it's also satisfying the local ventilation for this bathroom, so there is no deficit in this bathroom. Zero deficit. It can get confusing.
Right, and then I assume there was another question about the kitchen being 80, and I just said that's because there's an operable window which deducts 20 from the original 100 CFM needed. Is that correct?
That's right. Okay. If there's no fan in the kitchen, the deficit is 100, but we are allowed to reduce that deficit by 20 CFM if there is an openable window. So if we reduce a deficit of 100 by 20, that gives us a deficit of 80. That's where that came from.
Okay, and then back to that original fan, is that a demand-controlled fan, the existing 32 CFM one in the master bed? Do we consider that demand?
In the master bathroom, yes, it's probably best to assume that that's a demand-controlled fan, controlled by a switch that the occupant flicks on and off, or controlled by an occupancy sensor.
All right, back to you, Rick. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Oh, actually, you know what? I do want to make a little note here. Keep the questions coming. These questions are great. This is the difference between just watching a video and actually being on a webinar, is that you have a chance to actually interact. You can customize it per your questions. And I'll do my best to answer your questions as quickly as I can. If I can't answer them, then when Rick takes a break, we'll ask him. And I mean, what a great opportunity for you to for the price of $0 to be able to talk to Rick Karg, an ASHRAE expert. And so keep sending those questions. Thanks, Rick. Back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Jay. Some additional provisions of the 2016 standard. Attached garages. Do your best to prevent the migration of contaminants to the adjoining occupiable spaces. Seal the joints. The standard says nothing about how to make sure that, or how to confirm that you've done a good job sealing the joints. Informally, however, a good way to do this is with zone pressure diagnostics. The second blue bullet, any ducts in the garage must leak less than 6% of the total heating and cooling system airflow. So if there is ductwork out there, if there is an air handler out there, it's a very good idea to make sure that that's tight. Labeling controls for dwelling unit ventilation must be labeled as to their function. So I don't know if you can see this, but the type on the switchblade says primary ventilation system. There are organizations that are coming up with some good decals and things that you can just stick on your control plates to help you out in the field. Those should be around fairly soon. Sound ratings for fans. These are for, the first two bullets are for new fans. 1 zone is the maximum for continuously operating fans or for double duty fans that you install. By double duty, what I mean is a fan that you install in a bathroom that supplies your local ventilation, and it also serves as the dwelling unit ventilation. So a fan like that, like a really good Panasonic or Braun or Air King fan, must operate at 1 zone or less. If it only serves as local ventilation, say a kitchen fan or a local bathroom fan, 3 zones or less if it's a new fan. If it's already there, you don't have to worry about the amount of sound that it makes. It's not your responsibility. If it's already there and you're going to leave it there. However, if there's a fan there and it's your decision to replace that fan, you must comply with these sound requirements. And you must put in, if it's a bathroom, a 50 CFM fan, or if it's a kitchen, either a 100 CFM fan if it's a range hood, or a 300 CFM fan if it's a downdrafting fan or ceiling or wall fan. Ducting, a few things about ducting. There is a prescriptive table in the standard that helps with duct sizing. Rigid ductwork is preferred, but flexible ductwork is okay. We don't want this kind of thing to happen. Carbon monoxide alarms are required, at least one in every house, by the ASHRAE standard. I think most of your programs are already doing this, so it's not something you need to add to that. For resources, what you see here, I tried to compile some things that might be helpful to you. The Residential Energy Dynamics site, where you can find the calculation aid and some other things, some other tools that might very well help you with ventilation. You can find the ASHRAE standard free online, and I'll show you where to find that. You can buy the standard. I'm now on the 3rd bullet. I think it's about $60, but my suggestion is you figure out how to see the free one online. You can't download this, you cannot save it, but you cannot print it. But you can read the whole standard online. It's fairly easy to get to, but you cannot get there directly. I'll show you where you can find out how to get there. The 62.2 2016 User's Manual is now completed. It's available for purchase on the ASHRAE website. There is Paul Raymer's Residential Ventilation Handbook, which was published in 2010, and a related document is Guideline 24, 2015, which has a lot to say about air quality and contaminants. I want to bring to your attention a couple of tools that my company, Residential Energy Dynamics, also put together. There's an air cycler application that's free online that helps you calculate the cost of ventilating, both the cost of operating the fans, including a furnace fan if that's part of your ventilation system, and the heating and cooling loss. You will find that it's not all that expensive. Here are some values at the bottom here for a sample house. You put in the zip code and the cost of fuel and electricity, and the weather data is all taken care of for you. You can choose from 8 different configurations. Of course, these are keyed to the air cycler products because they paid for it. There's also one we did for Panasonic, which is quite similar. The choices here, again, 8 choices. These are keyed for Panasonic products. And now I'm going to go to the red tool here. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
You can see my screen. Okay, good. So this is the home page of the Residential Energy Dynamics website. I'm showing you this for a couple of reasons. First of all, I mentioned the ASHRAE 62.2, 2013 and 2016 online. They're online free. I'm not going to go through this, but this explains how to get there. So go to the Residential Energy Dynamics homepage. It's explained right here. And there's also a short video on the RED YouTube channel. For the other two applications I just showed you, the Panasonic one and the air cycler one, you can find those right here. These are the links you can go to find those. So those are easy to find also. This is the Panasonic tool. This is live. You can see its drop-down menus and such. And here is the air cycler tool. Now this is the live version of the ASHRAE 62.2 2016 RED tool. It's free. When you go to the page, it doesn't look quite like this. You'll have other things on it, like the navigation menu over here, and there'll often be some ads on, depending upon what page you're on. But I've taken all that off this so it's not as cluttered. And this is the tool, the calculation aid. And it's based on the 2016 standard. And you can, there's the whole thing. And I'll just go through this quickly. All of the labels, the input labels or the result labels, if you click on them or touch them, if you are on a touch device like a tablet or a smartphone, you'll get an explanation of what that particular input requires or what the result includes. There are drop-down menus here. We have existing or new. My guess is most of you on the call are working on existing homes, so I'll leave it like that, on existing. Now, I talked about the horizontally attached infiltration credit, and I said that the RED calculation aid helps you through that. This is a new question right here. Dwelling unit is, and then you have two choices. This was not in the 2013 version. This is the way we have taken care of the horizontally attached multifamily building. So normally, for most of you, you would have it detached. That would be a single family dwelling unit, a home that's detached. But you can choose the other one. If it's attached to other dwelling units, you choose that one, and then there's another question. Only walls are in common with other dwelling units. If you choose yes, then what happens is that this section of the tool opens up right here. Area of common walls, envelope area adjoining garage, remaining envelope area, and it calculates a sub-exterior for you and takes care of everything. Notice what happens, if you can, to this section of the tool if I go back to detached housing. Notice it disappears. Also notice, if I click this again, if I have stacked dwelling units, the answer to this question of only walls are in common with other dwelling units is no. If I click that, most of the tool goes away because a great part of the tool has to do with calculating the infiltration credit. And there's no infiltration credit available to stacked multifamily dwelling units, so it takes care of it for you there. So I'll go back to this, and I'm going to go back to detached just to simplify here. This is where you choose the closest weather station. You have US and Canada, and you've got all the states here, of course, and I've chosen Colorado. There are approximately 1,100 weather stations that are available here. They are exactly the same as in the 2013 version of the standard. Floor area, by the way, you can choose units here. You can change units as you go along, or you can change them globally with the preferences. You can also do math on the fly. You can do calculations within this input box if you want to. Number of occupants, you have a choice of from 1 to 10. I've chosen 4. The dwelling height, and this is the measured CFM 50 of 1400. There is a section for advanced blower door units. If you click on that, it gives you some more options. You can enter altitude if you want to, and you can enter temperature. And that will adjust your answer accordingly. It's a good thing to use if it's really cold outside, really warm outside, or if you're at quite a high altitude. Now I'll close that again. Use the local ventilation alternative compliance. I'll come back to that. That's for existing homes only. If I click new up here, that goes away. Here are the primary results. The effective annual average infiltration rate, 58 for this house. Total required ventilation rate, Q tot, is 96. That's the basic equation we looked at, 3% of the floor area plus 7.5 CFM times the number of bedrooms plus 1. This is the infiltration credit, which comes from the data right here. And here is the required mechanical ventilation rate, QFAN, of 38. So this 38 does not include the alternative compliance path, but now I'm going to include it. Now notice what happens to the 38. It's now gone up to 48 because we've added 10 to it right here. And this is the same example we looked at before. So do we want to use the kitchen? Well, you check that to activate the kitchen. You have up to 5 bathrooms. I've chosen 2. So we'll say the kitchen has an existing fan, 65 CFM, and openable window, so the deficit is 15. Bathroom 1 has a fan that's 25 CFM. We've measured it. Has an openable window, so the deficit is 5. And bathroom 2 is 30 CFM measured, no openable window. The deficit is 20. The total deficit is 40. And remember, in the simple math, we merely divide that by 4. That's what is done right here. And we add then 10 to get 48. Now remember, watch this 48 right here. If I turn this off, take away the alternative compliance, now this goes back down to 38. If I turn it on again by clicking, all the same values are still there. It comes into play in the calculation. So we see it's 48. So that's taken care of for you. The horizontally attached is taken care of for you, and there's quite a bit of error catching to help you out here so that you don't make errors. We need 48. Let's say that the fan that you've got in a box on the shelf is 110 capacity. If you put that in there, it tells you how many minutes that has to run every hour at 110 CFM to give you 48, the equivalent of 48 CFM operating all the time. This is for intermittent operation. And if you're interested in the de minimis, let's say your target ventilation rate is 15, well, for this particular house, as it's defined here with the height and the CFM 50, the square footage, the alternative compliance part, if you want to know what CFM 50 complies with or corresponds with 15 CFM fan, put 15 in that box or click outside that box. So a CFM 50 of 2200 would give you a result right here of 15, which means you wouldn't have to put any of it in. Remember, that's the de minimis. But we're already down to 1400, so that just doesn't come into play here. But that's what this section of the tool is. If you want to know what zero ventilation would be, how loose the house has to be, well, 2570. So that's what that is about. So that's a quick overview of the tool, and I'm ready and open for questions.
Perfect.
About this or anything else.
Excellent. So we've got some questions about this, and then if we have some time, then I have some questions about professional football and the the trade deadline here coming up. So
okay.
I don't know if we'll get to that. But first question, which is actual a real question, do blower door numbers in single-family detached houses have any effect on the Q fan requirement? And I think he explains that essentially because the Q fan was listed underneath on your tool. Yeah, I think that was the Q tote, which is underneath. If that affects it.
Okay. This is, here is Q tote for this example. I turned off alternative compliance. Here is Q tote. Whether alternative compliance is on or not, that's not affected because Q tote is, let's call it the target rate, is based on 3% of the floor area plus the 7.5 CFM times the number of bedrooms plus 1, or the number of occupants. Q tote must be made up of two things. It's made up of natural air leakage, that's fresh air, we assume, and it's made up of mechanical ventilation. So the infiltration credit does have an impact on things. The leakier the house is, the lower the 38 is. Now 38 plus 58, guess what? It equals 96. Or 96 minus 58 is equal to 38. So if we made this house leakier, let me come up here and put in 2000 for the CFM 50, guess what's going to happen to Q fan? Now watch. Q tote's going to stay the same because that is not affected by the blower door number. I'm going to click outside the box and we go down to 13. Oh, and there's a nice little note that comes up. You don't have to put any in. There's a reminder because the de minimis just came into play. This is now less than 15, so you don't have to put any in. So, but my main point is to show you that the 96 stayed the same when I made the house looser. The infiltration credit went up, and therefore mechanical ventilation went down. I think that probably answers that question.
Absolutely. So the next one is there any altitude adjustment required?
There is no altitude adjustment required, but we have given you the opportunity to do that here with advanced blower door inputs. Now some of you, depending on where you're working, say you're in Denver and this house is in Denver, the altitude in Denver is, what is it? Let's say it's 6,000. It's right around there somewhere. Let's see what that does. And I've got to put some temperatures in here. Those are blank. I have to put some in. So it takes the 1400 CFM 50 and now it's higher. It's 1446. And that has changed, that has lowered our rate here by 2. Now if I unclick this, those numbers are still there, but they're no longer being used in the calculation. So we go back up 2 again. So because of entering the altitude, we get a leakier house, and we therefore have a higher infiltration rate right here, so a lower Q fan rate right here. It goes down by 2. And of course the temperature can do the same thing. Altitude merely affects the density of air. That's what this does. And the temperature has an impact on the density of air. So those all affect the CFM 50.
Excellent. So I've got these are some great ones. Thank you, Mr. Cruz, for this one. I love this question. All right, ready? Are garden-style apartments, both stacked and horizontal, eligible for infiltration credit? So the example is you have an eightplex in which 4 units are on the bottom next to each other and 4 units are stacked above.
It's a great question. So those are horizontally attached. However, that's not the only attachment. They're also stacked. So none of those are eligible for an infiltration credit. If a dwelling unit, even if it's 3 floors in height, like a row house, if there's another one above it, so the total floors are 6, but it's one 3-floor dwelling unit above another 3-floor dwelling unit, none of that is due an infiltration credit. Doesn't qualify for infiltration credit. And the garden style apartments as described by the questioner do not qualify. Now, if there's some offset involved, and say 1 or 2 of those apartments on the first floor do not have dwelling units above, if they are only horizontally attached, then those would qualify for a partial infiltration credit. Just those units, not the others. See, that's a great question.
Yeah, I get the feeling that that was a real life scenario. And same with this next one. The next one is when row homes are connected on both sides, but one home is abandoned or uninhabited, how would I calculate this scenario? Riddle me that. Thank you, Mr. Graves.
I'm not sure I understand. Let's make some, Jay, why don't you make some assumptions? One of them is abandoned. One of them is vacant.
I'm going to say
Let's
there's
call it
3.
vacant.
Yeah, if there's 3 and the one in the middle is vacant.
3 and the one in the middle is vacant. And the question is, do they qualify for a partial infiltration credit? Is that the question?
So. Yeah, the question, it says, how do I calculate that? But I think it's fair to interpret it in your terms.
Yeah, I think that in that case, whether the unit is occupied or not, all 3 of those would qualify for a partial infiltration credit. The question with any multifamily, which goes beyond what I can answer now and certainly beyond the ASHRAE standard, is how the heck do you get access to them, and how do you work all of this out with the building manager? And there are all those complicated issues with multifamily. But the only thing I can say is all 3 of those units do qualify for a partial infiltration credit as horizontally attached units.
Excellent. And it looks like we have a few questions here about the kitchen. Looks like one, I'm going to give you 2 of them because I think they're similar. You might be able to answer them. Why would the kitchen not be included when using the local ventilation alternative? And the other one says, let's see here, if you have a fan in the kitchen and bathroom, you must use the local ventilation alternative compliance.
Okay, I think those are good, and there are a lot of questions usually about the alternative compliance path. A reason you would not use the kitchen or not even consider it, I just turned the kitchen off by clicking. I'm going to unclick it so the kitchen isn't there anymore, so it doesn't come into play. If you are going to install a new compliant fan in the kitchen as part of your work, there is no reason to include it in the alternative compliance path section of the tool right here. So you could just shut the kitchen off. But if you want, you can do it like this. So the kitchen, the new fan you put in has a flow rate of 150 CFM. You could put that in there too, and it has an operable window. You get exactly the same thing. The total deficit is 25. Notice there's no deficit for the kitchen because there's a fan that is compliant So you can either put the data in the input box, as I have done here, or not even consider it at all. You get exactly the same answer. In both cases, our required ventilation is 44. It's 44 there. If I turn the kitchen back on, it's still 44. So that's a reason. So if the fan is already there and it's compliant, if it's 100 CFM or more, if there's an openable window, it wouldn't even have to be 100, right? If it's 80, this makes it compliant and there's no deficit, right? So you could, in that case, if you know that, you could just not even consider it. Something I like to do when I'm doing a job, I like to put it in and then I print this. I've usually got my tablet, my iPad, and what I do is take a screenshot of the tool, of this tool. I squeeze it down so it fits on the whole screen. Take a screenshot. I can send it to the office or I can print it later. And if I include the kitchen, now I know what I had there. You know, if I put in a 150 CFM fan, I know I did that. Whereas if I turn the kitchen off, I don't have a record of what I did with the kitchen. So I like to do it this way. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. I have another question. So I guess there's a prequel to this question. Did you know there's somebody else named Cal Steiner besides Cal Steiner?
I didn't.
I didn't either, because the Cal Steiner that we know I thought was retired, but somebody else named Cal Steiner apparently is on this webinar and would like to know if the 78 CFM in the kitchen satisfies the 58 CFM requirement.
I'm not sure what that means. I'm not so sure this is a new Cal Steiner. I think it might be the same one.
You think so?
Yeah,
He's
confusing
retired.
questions. Yeah, what does he mean?
Oh, he's probably trying to confuse you if it's the old Cal Steiner, or I'm sorry, the
Yeah,
previous Cal Steiner.
yeah, I don't know. I don't know what that question means.
Okay, we'll just flip. I'll just erase it.
Okay.
Is there a climate zone
Sorry,
allowance?
Cal Steiner. Is there a what, Jay?
Is there a climate zone allowance?
No, all of that is gone. I'm going back to climate zones, the climate zones, the shielding factors, way back to the 4 climate zones. That all disappeared with ASHRAE 62.1989, and it's 62.2 has never been that way. And we have much more accurate weather data now, a much better way with these weather stations here. And we've got 1,100 rather than just 4 climate zones. We've got 1,100 weather stations. And it's all based on something called TMY3 weather data, typical meteorological data, typical meteorological year data. The 3rd iteration of that, and it's considered to be quite accurate. Do not use it in the same way you would use heating degree days. It's not compiled data as heating degree days or cooling degree days are. This is typical data. It doesn't change from year to year, whereas heating degree days and cooling degree days do. So no, there's no climate zone adjustment. It's all taken care of when you choose the appropriate weather station. And of course, if you decide not to use the infiltration credit, if you can still see my screen, watch what happens. If I click no, a great deal of the inputs disappear. The height, the CFM 50, so much of it is there to calculate the infiltration rate, including the climate. That's the only thing we need the climate for, is to calculate the infiltration rate, as well as the height and the leakage rate and some other things.
All right, so looks like we've got I think it's be a good time to move on here. We're getting a lot of follow-up questions from some of this first questions that were asked, and I think we've still got some stuff to cover, right? So
No,
I'll hand it back. No?
no, no.
Okay, great. Well, then let's. If you got it, so I'll. So you see, cats and dogs, cats, dogs, fish.
Yes,
Are those?
bring it
Do
on.
we? Do those? Do we consider when entering occupants? Do we have a standard for cats, dogs, fish tanks, smokers, etc.?
No, we have none of that. It's a fair question, especially big dogs. It's a fair question, and I suggest that the analyst, when the analyst is in the field, that they use their best judgment. Generally speaking, we're after people, but there are dogs that we would count a 40-pound little boy, wouldn't we, as an occupant, and we might have a dog that weighs 100 pounds. So what do you do? Generally speaking, the ASHRAE standard doesn't get into that, doesn't get into pets or aquariums or smokers. So it doesn't deal with it. It's beyond the scope of the standard. So I really can't answer that. Use your best judgment. That's about all I can say.
Excellent. So we did have a question about multifamily examples. What are your thoughts about that? An example of how you would you basically use this tool on a detached single-family home the same as you would on a horizontally connected row house?
Yes, just quickly, I would at the top dwelling unit, if it's a row house or a duplex or a triplex, dwelling unit it's not detached, it is attached to another dwelling unit or units. So then another input appears. Only walls are in common with other dwelling units. If that answer is yes, we're in business, we can take a partial infiltration credit. If that answer is no, lots of things disappear because no infiltration credit is allowed. So let's go back to yes. So the part of the tool that just appeared is right here, if you can see my pointer. Area, let's say this is a duplex. We're interested in a duplex. Area of common walls. One wall in common with another. We'll say that's 400 as I've entered here. Envelope area adjoining a garage. We'll say that's 200. Garages are included here in the horizontally attached section. Remaining envelope area, 1,000. And again, if you click here or touch it, it explains what these inputs are to be. So this gives us the total envelope area, 400 plus 200 plus 1,000, and this includes the floor and ceiling also, even though those may not be attached to another dwelling unit, 1,600, and we have the numbers here with which to adjust the infiltration credit accordingly. So here we have an infiltration credit of 36. Now keep that in mind. Let's go back and say now that this is not attached to another dwelling unit. Let's say it's detached. Now the infiltration goes up to 58. So you can see if it is attached horizontally only, we are allowed to take a partial infiltration credit. And you can see 58 is the full, and if I make these attached again, the partial is 36. So the required mechanical ventilation rate, Q fan, goes up to 66. Well, that's a quick example of horizontally attached multifamily.
Awesome. That helps a lot. And I think Okay, so either the someone else named Cal Steiner or the original Cal Steiner wants to take a second shot at this question.
Okay.
Says, sorry, we had some wrong numbers in a small phone keyboard. If an existing fan CFM is greater than the required CFM after all inputs, does that satisfy ASHRAE if we label it?
The ASHRAE standard, I think I understand that one, Cal. The ASHRAE standard is a minimum standard. So if it states, for example, that the dwelling unit ventilation should be, as we have, let's see, okay, as we have here, 44. If the dwelling unit ventilation needs to be 44, that's a minimum ventilation rate. If you want to install 60, you are in compliance. If you want to install 45, you're in compliance, or 44, but if you install 42, you are not in compliance with the standard. I hope that answers Cal's question.
It definitely satisfied me.
Good. Well, he's a very difficult man to satisfy.
That's the truth.
Yeah.
That's why, and I don't want to, I don't want to cast aspersions at his taste in football, since that's our joke of the day. However, well, we just got so many questions. I think they can just keep going and going. Tell me when we're getting close. Are we doing about 3 more minutes of this? What do you think?
Yes.
Okay. So, just to clarify, the enclosed kitchen with other fan, the 5 ACH, is that for the kitchen volume only?
Good question. Yes, if it's an enclosed kitchen, 5 ACH running all the time as a local fan is allowed. And the 5 ACH is based upon the enclosed kitchen volume. And remember that the enclosed is determined by 60 or fewer square feet of area of attachment to other parts of the house. If it's a non-enclosed kitchen, the 5 ACH is not an allowed way to supply the local ventilation. It would have to be on demand, demand-controlled ventilation.
Okay, and so want to go back to the multifamily subject. The question here is, so for multifamily, you would perform this calculation for each unit, not a building as a whole, correct?
Good question. Yes, for each unit. And of course, remember, say it's a triplex or row houses, the 3 in a row, you're going to have different geometry. So the credit will be, the coefficient, the multiplier, the A sub exterior will be different for the end units than it will be for the center unit. So yes, it must be calculated for each unit individually, rather than the whole building.
All right, excellent. So sorry if we couldn't get to all of your questions. Rick, thanks so much. Bill, if you're out there, if you want to take us out, but I believe that we will take a look at some of the questions that we just couldn't get to, and try and get back to you as soon as possible. And as always, we have about 72 hours to get your CEUs in. If you don't have if we don't get the Citrix report here, the GoToWebinar report that says that you've been paying attention to the screen for long enough, unfortunately, we will not be able to give you CEUs. If you haven't given us your BPI number, we won't be able to give you CEUs. And unfortunately, you can only get CEUs if you watch this live. You cannot get CEUs if you are watching the recording of this. And other Bill, if you're out there, if you want to take us out.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Wanted to. We should have done this before, but wanted to let you know that it's kind of Rick's background here. Shoot, that was the wrong slide. But Rick does have a very illustrious background, and he is very well qualified to present on this topic. including all the time he spent working in the software development for residential energy analysts, the awards he's received, and the career he's had working in the residential energy field. Also wanted to just give you a picture here of the two folks that are behind the scenes here. And today, mainly, it was Jay West. He's a principal at High Performance Human Habitats Training Consulting, and myself, Bill, at TrueTechTools.com. So I want to thank everyone for attending, and just trying to take a look at the questions here. Okay. We want to really appreciate you attending, and we'll be posting future webinars at the TrueTechTools.com/events page, our events calendar, for you to keep track of that. Or if you subscribe to our newsletter, you'll be able to keep track of our future upcoming webinars. Jay's helping us out with this aspect, and I think it was a great asset to have him here today, and especially big thanks to Rick for your presentation and sharing your knowledge of the subject.
My pleasure, Bill. Thank you. And thank you, Jay, and thanks everyone for attending.
Yeah, thanks. Will RED be at ACI? I know True Tech Tools will.